Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be covering the Cold War AK47 in Warzone, whether or not it's viable after they've actually gone and fixed all the different attachments. Obviously, they're not all fixed, and it's not a perfect world where everything works the way it says it works. But we're going to go ahead and take a look at whether or not this weapon is viable and how it should be used within the current meta. Obviously, there's the sniper support meta, or AUG support meta, or AMAX support meta, basically something long range, and then this will be used at close range, or to use this as a long range option because it has enough bullet velocity, and stack this with something like the FFAR, MAC-10, Bullfrog, LC-10, whatever it is. We'll be looking at those various scenarios and what class setup you should be using with this weapon. And if you enjoy the video or learned something new, please do me a favor, hit that like button. Goal on today is again 10,000 likes, which you guys have been crushing, which I'm very appreciative of. And if you're brand new or haven't yet subscribed, double check, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on by hitting the red subscribe button and turning those notifications on, because currently about 57% of you guys haven't hit that subscribe button. And also a reminder, today happens to be the anniversary of Warzone, my birthday, and the day that we're releasing the merch, which you can see right here is available from the 10th to the 13th. I'm going to be tweeting about it at noon Pacific, 3 Eastern, and 8 p.m. over GMT. Whichever time zone you're in, you are available, and this thing pretty much ships anywhere. I'm going to have 2 variants of sweaters and then also 2 variants of hats. So if you guys are interested in supporting the channel, you want some merch, definitely go check out that link, which will be near the top of the description. Now back to the AK-47. So one of the biggest issues with this gun prior to the Season 2 updates is that you really couldn't run any of the barrels. They all had negative consequences, or they did nothing at all. They reduced your bullet velocity by like 30%, your range by another 20%. So there was really no reason and no benefit of actually using any of those. The bullet velocity as they were was only about 600, which isn't all that great. Normally for a medium long range option to be even viable, normally you want it right around 800, and even that's not even all that great. But it's close to 1,000 as you can get somewhere in that particular range. So that's one part of the gun, and that really wasn't usable. It has a really weird recoil pattern. We're going to talk about what you can do to help with that, and how much that will actually impact the TTK, because there are things that you're going to need to do to change up the fire rate, which we'll go ahead and talk about. But now that those things are fixed, we can actually have an honest discussion of whether or not this is actually going to fit into the meta. Personally, I think it is viable. I think there's scenarios where it's definitely top tier viable. Meta, probably not. The AUG is too good currently. M16 is still pretty decent. AMAX is pretty nasty at range. So it's pretty difficult to stack up against those long range options. So it's going to fit more of the role of a support weapon. Whether if it's going to be a long range support in some way, I think it can definitely pull that off, because its TTK is very competitive with pretty much the SMGs or the meta, MAC-10, Bullfrog, MP5. It fits within that range, but it has a little bit more range than those, so it's very consistent TTK and actually outperforms all of those weapons because its range is extended beyond the normal SMG. So its main competition currently, in my opinion, is the FFAR, just being wildly broken and needing a nerf in some way, but we'll obviously get to that. So I think the first place we should start is that recoil pattern, since that is a huge determining factor of whether or not people will actually use this weapon. I have the base recoil pattern here on the left in yellow. We're not really going to focus too much on that, because for the vast majority out there, once you level it up, you're going to run this thing with the suppressor, and the GRU suppressor is going to be the way to go, because it helps with vertical recoil, it helps with bullet velocity, range, and only has a slight penalty to your ADS speed. So once we go ahead and stack the GRU suppressor with the base one here, you can see the yellow outline of the box filled in with the blue, which is the GRU suppressor. And I felt like this was a better way to do this. I've done this a little bit and we're improving on these. So if you got suggestions, definitely let me know in the comment section. So right now what we do is we combine, take a given that you're going to be using the GRU suppressor because of how many benefits it has, and then we're going to stack that with the other attachments, and you can kind of see what this is actually doing to those recoil patterns. And I've taken an average of both of the recoil patterns to form the box that you see between them. So it doesn't necessarily represent the one on the left or the right. It's a combination of both of those, so we get a little bit more accuracy in what is actually happening with these recoil patterns. So it looks like with the foregrip, if you're combining that, it is helping with the horizontal, which it says it does, but the vertical isn't really getting much help there. Obviously, I could have probably done this 10 times and maybe had a little bit less recoil, but is essentially doing what it says, which doesn't really help this recoil pattern all that much, in my opinion. If we go with the Spetsnaz grip, the normal one, not the speed grip, we end up with that as well. The GRU suppressor and Spetsnaz, you can see the combination ends up being even tighter on both sides than just running the Gfuel suppressor by itself, or the normal recoil pattern of the base AK47. When we go ahead and go over here to the speed grip, you can see it's helping out with the horizontal and 0 with the vertical, which perfectly aligns with this description, so it makes a lot of sense. Obviously, there are some other benefits related to certain attachments that we're not really covering with recoil here, and pros and cons with ADS speed, strafe movement speed, hip fire spread. There's other things, but this is specifically recoil, and these are essentially doing what they're supposed to. Then we have the regular speed grip, which is the rear stock, which Exclusive Ace was able to find, and it was primarily for that particular attachment, and it looks like there is some kind of helping going on here, even if it is very minor to that speed grip. And then to get the absolute lowest, what I did is I took the Spetsnaz grip, which is pretty clear that you're getting the least amount of recoil there, with the Gfuel suppressor, and combined it with that speed grip from the rear grip, and you can see it even goes even further on tightening up this spread significantly. So if you're a fan of the iron sights, or you don't really want to run a barrel, you can combine those 3 attachments to pretty much get that least amount of any kind of side-to-side movement and tightening across the board. That is going to be the best recoil option. So that's the part for the recoil pattern. We're going to talk about how to fix that little squiggly that we get in there as we go through the weapons. One of the things is when you actually compare this to 2 of the other main meta guns, which are the FFAR and the AMAX, you can see that it stacks up pretty decent, but it doesn't take the lead in any of these categories for the TTK, but it is still pretty competitive. So when we look at that close range TTK for the chest shots, you can see that the FFAR comes in at 467, while the AMAX is just a hair slower at 476. Keeping in mind that the AMAX is just a little bit of a slower weapon, so it's going to be even slower once you're actually using the weapon, because it's going to take you a little bit longer to get on target. Cold War AK47 comes in right around 500 at 492 at that close range engagement. These are like sub 25 meters. Everything beyond that, around longer range engagements, you get into that second damage drop off. You can see the FFAR drops down to 600, which is the slowest in the bunch, not by much, but it is. Then the AMAX comes in handy because of that chest shot multiplier being as good as it is. And then we have the Cold War AK47 coming in at right around 600. So it's very comparable to the FFAR in a lot of ways. It's very negligible difference. The big difference comes in when you get into stomach and limb shots, because it doesn't do quite as much damage as the FFAR at maintaining its damage multiplier, because those numbers are a lot closer together. There's a bigger gap between the AMAX and the AK47 if you're not landing those chest shots. Something to consider, but it's also what has made the FFAR so disgusting compared to a lot of the other close range options, like the SMGs that have various damage multipliers that drop off pretty hard if you're not landing chest and headshots. And you can see from the TTK there, if you're not landing chest shots, the TTK drops off pretty hard, and it becomes a little bit less competitive. So the gun, that's really what separates it from being in the meta. If we had an AK-47 that had limb damage where it kind of came up to 425 versus the 491, you'd probably see more people using this weapon, even with its weird recoil. So the TTK alone is enough to make it where it's just not going to be the meta, and not everyone's going to jump on it, even though it can definitely be viable. If you're landing one bullet ahead of the other person, you're going to win the gunfight. It's the same thing with the damage range drop off. The recoil does get a little bit weird. That's why you're most likely going to run this as a long range support option, and you won't really get into too many engagements beyond that, so you won't likely have to reach into that 700 millisecond TTK, which is kind of slow when you're factoring in the FFAR and the AMAX are both faster than that. So that's kind of a little bit of an explanation of why I don't see it becoming the meta, and why it can definitely be viable within the meta, but don't expect to win every gunfight against the FFAR. Next thing we can talk about is the barrels. Pretty much everything on this gun is kind of copy and paste over from the XM4, which is kind of what we saw before. When the XM4 was broken, all the barrels had the same penalty, and that's kind of what we're seeing in this particular instance. You can look at the base, bullet velocity, and range, a little bit longer than the XM4. Instead of 22, it's up to 25, so built in a little bit better range, which also means the range attachments do a little bit more because the base is a little bit higher. So it's kind of how the math works out. You can see the Gfuel suppressor is going to buff the bullet velocity and range. Reinforced, kind of like the reinforced heavy, does this pretty much the exact same thing. The Liberator does its little thing, and then we got the Takedown, which doesn't do quite as much, and if you just looked at the stat line by itself, you'd be like, it's not really worth using. but some people might be a fan of that extra strafe speed. Keeping in mind that 750 bullet velocity, if you're using this as a support option, is still pretty solid. You're going to be able to hit shots just as they get a little bit further away, a little less practical, so you're going to have to be very comfortable with whatever your long range option is, whether that is the AUG or the Kar 98 or SPR or whatever you want to use as the long range option. And then when it comes to combining those with the Gru suppressor, you can see that we get a little over 1,000 bullet velocity with about 35 range for the meters, which is a pretty solid option considering this is going to be your short range option. You'll probably end up with a little bit more engagements up to that 35 meter range. Not like the same issue where we had with the XM4 where the TTK just was not fast enough. Then we combine the Liberator with the Gru. You can see that you get around 1250, same thing we had before, and then only up to about 27 meters. So it does end up being a trade-off since this isn't really all that great at a long range option based off the recoil pattern. Then we have the last one, which is the takedown barrel with that Gru suppressor. And you can see you get up to about 1,000 meters per second. Bullet velocity, but no additional range, so it'll be capped right at that 25. Again, these come down to preference. If you want the extra strafe speed, because maybe you're going to put on an optic because you don't like the iron sights, or maybe something along those lines, you get a little bit of flexibility on how you want to build it. That's why I typically go into different numbers, so you kind of have a better idea how you want to build the weapon for yourself, not necessarily just copy and paste what I prefer. So one of the things now I wanted to talk about is intermittent firing. That's probably the best way to use this weapon if somebody ends up being at range. Obviously, if somebody's up close, you're just gonna have to deal with that recoil. Normally, it's gonna be pretty manageable. After about 12, 13 bullets, it kind of does a down hook and then it goes and continues back up. After that little hook is done. I don't think really many people can control that at range while holding full auto, unless you're Zoro or something like that. You know, you're used to having that little Z pattern going on, right? Besides that, I don't think that's practical. So the ideal way that you probably want to use this weapon is to use a burst firing mechanic where you hold the trigger for approximately 10, 12 bullets, release for a millisecond, and then pull the trigger again. Release for a millisecond, pull the trigger again. Release for a millisecond, pull the trigger again. I did this, and you can see in the gameplay in the background, that's essentially what I'm doing. This did end up slowing down the fire rate by about 6% on the net side of it, which doesn't have a huge impact on the TTK after analyzing the numbers. So you could still do this and keep relatively close to the TTK, and it'd probably be even closer to that theoretical TTK that we showed initially because you're not going to miss as many shots at range. You're just going to hold the trigger, good vertical recoil for 13 bullets, you pull down, you release, pull down, release, and you just continue holding versus having to go up, and then it's just very awkward. So that's how I would recommend using this weapon. If you're going to try to take on a target a little bit further away and you feel like that recoil is going to get away from you, just release, pull the trigger again, and that'll go ahead and reset that predictive recoil, because that's essentially how the recoil patterns work. They always start from bullet one every time you release the trigger and pull the trigger. So it's like sometimes semi-auto, if you got a really fast trigger finger, you can get away with it and it'll feel like the gun has almost no recoil. With all that being said, let's get into some class setup. So based on what I've talked about so far, you'll probably have an idea of where I'm going with my class setup. Obviously, I'm gonna use the Gru suppressor. I'm gonna use the Spetsnaz grip because that one offered the best benefit. I don't really think this one offers enough benefit to use that over maybe an optic or a stock or something else, 5 milliwatt laser that's going to help the hip fire. I personally don't think it was enough. And then when it comes to the ammo, I'm going to go with the 60 round mag. You can go with the fast mag if you want. Typically, the only difference is a little bit slower ADS for a slightly better reload speed that you might not even notice. So there's such a negligible difference. But personally, I almost always go with the regular one because there's not a big enough difference or advantage in worsening your ADS speed for a fraction of a second of faster reload speed. So that's kind of those three main attachments. I think most people will go that route. The next one is going to be the barrel. You're pretty much going to go through one of the three different barrels that I talked about. I think since you're not really going to use this one ever at range, I think the Liberator is kind of off the table unless you're just godly at controlling that recoil and you master that pattern, you master the burst delay, whatever. I don't think the Liberator is going to be the way to go. I think takedown barrel is pretty good because you get that extra strafe speed, which is very essential in these close range engagements. You can just make yourself move so fast, makes it a little bit harder for you to get hit, stay on target, whatever the case is. You get used to it. The one that I think the vast majority will go with will be this reinforced because it gives you a pretty solid bullet velocity and a range that is also practical for how you're going to use this weapon a majority of the time, which can actually drop a bullet to kill, which can allow you to win a gunfight, especially with a recoil that is a little bit inconsistent at times. So now that you have that, you can pretty much go with whatever way you want. I think most people tend to go with the stock or a no stock for a little bit better sprint to fire time. But personally, what I did, I would use an optic and a reflex. That's just because what ends up happening with this type of weapon, especially if I'm going to use this as a support option, I want to be able to make sure I hit my targets. And a lot of times with the iron sights, if it's a lot of vertical recoil, personally, it makes it a little bit tricky, because if my iron sights get above my target's head, I lose my target, and I am not a fan of that. So that is a personal preference. A regular reflex sight, for some of you that don't care and you're going to use iron sights, more power to you. I would use steady aim laser, 5 milliwatt laser, or I would use the no stock, or I would use this last stock, which is a skeleton stock, which is going to give you the extra strafe speed and things along those lines with the worst hip fire. So you got the options there. Choose what makes the most sense to you. Hopefully you guys did enjoy the video, learned something new. If you did, please do me a favor, hit that like button. If you're brand new, want to find your way back, double check, make sure you subscribe with notifications on. Also, just a heads up, your support on the Gfuel this month has pushed us into round 2, and we're looking like we're going to make it in round 3 of the Gfuel March Madness. So I definitely appreciate your support on that, guys. That should be up on the 11th, so my code is discounted if you're looking to restock or try something new. Appreciate all the support on the channel. Thank you for watching. As always, have a great day.